What kind of warrior forces a Christian abbot to urinate on his own altar while reciting pagan prayers? Who develops specific rituals to humiliate monks, using exactly the sacred objects they most venerated? What kind of culture creates elaborate ceremonies to psychologically destroy Christian faith? That warrior was the Viking, and everything you learned about them through series and films is a fantasy that hides systematic religious hatred. Imagine that you are a monk in the monastery of Lindisfarne, on the coast of England, in the year 793. It's a peaceful June morning. You're copying sacred manuscripts when you hear a sound that will redefine your understanding of human evil. They are not common war cries. They are chants in a strange language, rhythmic like prayers, but loaded with pure malice. You run to the window and see enormous men emerging from long ships, but they are not attacking randomly. They are moving with perverse religious purpose, carrying pagan symbols, singing counter-prayers specifically directed to profane your Christian faith. You realize with horror that they know exactly where the most sacred objects of the monastery are located. They know the routine of the monks. They understand the spiritual meaning of each Christian ritual they are about to invert. They told you that Vikings attacked monasteries because they were easy and rich targets, full of gold without military protection. They made you believe they were opportunistic bandits seeking quick wealth. But the documentary truth is different. Vikings developed specific methods and elaborate rituals that had as their sole objective to destroy not only people, but the Christian faith itself. The attacks on monasteries were not common looting operations. They were religious war campaigns, conducted with military precision and theological hatred that rivaled any subsequent crusade. Vikings not only stole sacred treasures, they perverted them, transforming them into instruments of humiliation specifically intended to break Christian belief. An analysis of Viking attack patterns reveals something terrifying. They previously studied each monastery. They knew their liturgical calendars, knew which days were most sacred, and they attacked precisely on those days, not by coincidence, but to maximize the psychological impact of profanation. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles reveal the truth. Written by contemporary survivors, they describe attacks where Vikings forced monks to participate in pagan rituals, using sacred Christian objects. Communion chalices transformed into cups for drinking human blood. Crucifixes used as instruments of psychological torture. Gospels burned while Vikings recited blasphemies specifically created for each biblical passage. The attack on Lindisfarne was not the first test of a military strategy. It was the first public demonstration of a theology of hatred that Vikings had developed specifically against Christianity. They did not see Christians merely as enemies. They saw them as representatives of a religion that needed to be humiliated and perverted. Vikings developed dereligion rituals, specific ceremonies intended to force Christians to publicly renounce their faith through acts more devastating than death itself. It was religious psychological warfare on a scale that anticipated persecution practices that would only be seen again centuries later. The chronicler Alcuin of York, who corresponded with Charlemagne about Viking attacks, wrote something revealing. They did not come as common invaders, but as agents of an organized anti-Christianity. Alcuin had perceived something historians ignore. Vikings were theologians of hatred conducting a systematic religious campaign. Archaeological evidence confirms this interpretation. Monasteries attacked by Vikings show destruction patterns that were not random. Altars were specifically profaned, in ways that demonstrated intimate knowledge of Christian practices. Libraries were selectively burned, preserving some texts while destroying others, suggesting specific knowledge about what was being done and why. But this was just the beginning, because what Vikings really did inside monasteries, the specific rituals they developed, to break not only bodies but also Christian souls. This goes far beyond any concept you have about medieval religious conflict. Ivar the Boneless did not receive that name for a physical deformity. He received it for a different reason, because he developed methods to spiritually break his Christian enemies in such systematic ways that they literally lost psychological structure. Born around 830 in Denmark, Ivar was the son of Ragnar Lothbrok. But unlike his father, he had different interests. He was not interested in traditional looting. Ivar had a specific obsession, proving that the Christian god was inferior to Norse gods through methods that went far beyond simple military victory. What transformed Ivar happened in 855. During the siege of Paris, Ivar captured a bishop named Enmodus, and instead of killing him or asking for ransom, he conducted what the sagas call the first reverse conversion experiment. For 40 days, Ivar subjected the bishop to a process that combined physical deprivation, psychological manipulation, and carefully calibrated spiritual profanation. It was not random torture. It was apostasy engineering intended to make a man of faith renounce Christianity. The experiment worked. On the 40th day, Bishop Enmodus publicly declared that Thor was superior to Christ and voluntarily participated in pagan rituals. More importantly, Ivar had meticulously documented each stage of the process, creating the first manual of religious psychological warfare in history. From this experience, Ivar developed protocols, what the sagas of Ragnar call the Midgard Protocols, a complete system of techniques, specifically intended for monasteries and Christian institutions. They were not methods used against other pagans. They were tools created exclusively to combat Christianity. The protocols included specific techniques for each type of religious person. Young monks were subjected to elaborate carnal temptations to break vows of chastity. Abbots were forced to participate in blasphemous parodies of Christian masses. Scribes were obliged to copy pagan texts, using parchments made from destroyed Bibles. But the most sophisticated were the sacred inversion rituals. Ivar had studied Christian theology deeply, not out of religious interest, but to understand how to pervert each aspect of faith. He knew that simply destroying sacred objects was not sufficient. It was necessary to corrupt them in ways that caused maximum spiritual trauma. The Chronicles of Aben documented Viking attacks on Paris. They describe how Ivar transformed a captured church into an anti-temple. Christian altars were reconfigured for pagan sacrifices, using the same sacred objects that Christians venerated. Communion chalices were used for blood offerings. Crucifixes were incorporated into pagan totems as symbols of submission. More disturbing, Ivar recruited captured Christians to actively participate in the profanation of their own faith, not through simple coercion, but through psychological techniques that made victims believe they were making the right choice. It was religious brainwashing on an industrial scale. The success of Ivar's methods attracted other Viking leaders. He established the School of Jormungandr, a training center where young Vikings learned not only military tactics, but also Christian theology, conversion psychology, and systematic profanation techniques. Graduates of Ivar's school were responsible for the most devastating attacks of the Viking Age, not only in terms of physical destruction, but in terms of lasting spiritual trauma. Christian communities attacked by Ivar's disciples frequently abandoned Christian faith for generations. The chronicler Rimbert, biographer of Saint Ansgar, wrote that Ivar's methods were more dangerous to Christianity than all pagan armies, because armies could be defeated. But Ivar's techniques created doubt and apostasy that spread like an epidemic. When Ivar launched the Great Invasion of England in 865, he was not just seeking territorial conquest. He was implementing a plan to eradicate Christianity from the British Isles through methods that combined military warfare with spiritual warfare. And this was not the worst, because the methods Ivar developed were not restricted to Vikings. They were studied, copied, and adapted throughout history, establishing precedents for systematic religious persecution. That influenced psychological warfare practices for more than 1,000 years. In York, England, archaeologists discovered something that completely changed our understanding of Viking methods. Buried under the remains of St. Peter's Cathedral, they found a secret chamber that contained not only skeletons of monks, but physical evidence of rituals that defy any concept of normal medieval warfare. The bones show specific marks that were not from random violence. They were systematic patterns, pagan symbols carved into still-living bodies, evidence of procedures that lasted weeks. More disturbing, they found sacred Christian objects specifically modified to cause maximum spiritual suffering. Among the artifacts was a communion chalice with runic inscriptions that, when translated, revealed themselves to be blasphemous parodies of the most sacred Christian prayers. They were not vandalism, they were complete counter-liturgies, theologically sophisticated, intended to systematically invert each aspect of Christian faith. What Vikings did with sacred objects went far beyond simple profanation. They transformed them into instruments of forced conversion, through methods that combined psychological torture with spiritual manipulation. A crucifix found in York had been modified to function as a humiliation device, forcing Christian victims to assume positions that parodied crucifixion, while reciting pagan prayers. The excavations revealed evidence of what archaeologists call spiritual processing rooms. They were chambers specifically constructed to conduct the conversion rituals, developed by Ivar. The walls contained inscriptions that documented different techniques for different types of Christian resistance. For monks who refused to renounce their vows, Vikings used St. Anthony's temptation, prolonged exposure to temptations specifically calibrated to break monastic vows. For abbots, they applied the ritual of Loki, ceremony where the victim was forced to publicly blaspheme against Christ, using exactly the words they had used to preach. The most shocking discovery in York were the inverted Gospels, Christian manuscripts that had been systematically rewritten by Vikings. Each biblical passage had been carefully altered to promote pagan theology, maintaining the original structure, but completely inverting the meaning. The Gospel of St. John found in York had been modified, so that "in the beginning was the Word" became "in the beginning was the hammer," referring to Thor's hammer. Each miracle of Christ had been rewritten as a demonstration of Odin's superiority. It was sophisticated theological propaganda, disguised as Christian scripture. Vikings also developed the profanation calendar. They attacked specifically during important Christian festivals, not for tactical convenience but to maximize spiritual trauma. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost. Each sacred date became an opportunity to demonstrate that the Christian God was incapable of protecting his followers. Evidence from Lindisfarne shows that Vikings studied Christian practices for months before attacking. They knew which objects were most sacred to each community, which rituals were most important, which monks had the most spiritual influence. It was religious intelligence applied to psychological warfare. In some cases, Vikings kidnapped clerics, specifically to learn more about Christian theology. Not to convert, but to better understand how to attack faith more effectively. Captured monks were forced to teach Vikings about Christian doctrine, which was then used to create more precise profanations. The monastery of Skellig Michael in Ireland preserved records of how Vikings used theological knowledge to create specific doubts in Christian faith. They asked sophisticated questions about biblical contradictions, philosophical problems of Christianity, questions that medieval clerics were not prepared to answer under extreme pressure. Vikings declared that inadequate answers proved the superiority of Norse gods, who were more honest about the violent nature of the world. It was systematic pagan apologetics applied as a weapon of war. Documents reveal that Vikings transformed entire churches into functional anti-temples. Altars were reconfigured for human sacrifices using inverted Christian liturgy. Consecrated hosts were incorporated into pagan rituals. Communion wine was mixed with blood from animal sacrifices. And this was not the worst, because the methods developed by Vikings to systematically destroy Christian faith did not remain restricted to the Viking Age. They established precedents that were studied and refined by religious persecutors throughout all subsequent history. The most disturbing truth about Viking methods against Christian monasteries is not the brutality they practiced 1,000 years ago. It is how these techniques became the operations manual for all major religious persecutions that came after. In 1208, when Pope Innocent III officially established the Inquisition, the founding documents make direct reference to what they call Nordic conversion methods. The Church had meticulously studied Viking techniques and decided to apply them against their own religious enemies. The inverted Gospels developed by Vikings became the model for how the Inquisition dealt with heretical texts. Instead of simply burning problematic books, inquisitors systematically rewrote them, maintaining the original structure but altering the content to promote Catholic orthodoxy. The ritual of Loki, where Vikings forced religious leaders to blaspheme using their own words, became standard practice of the Inquisition. Captured heretics were obliged to publicly denounce their previous beliefs, using exactly the words they had used to promote them. During the Protestant Reformation, both Catholics and Protestants used variations of Viking techniques. The spiritual processing rooms found in York became the model for religious interrogation chambers throughout Europe. The Viking profanation calendar influenced how persecutors chose specific dates to maximize spiritual trauma. During the colonization of the Americas, Spanish missionaries used methods derived directly from Viking protocols to convert native populations. The irony was devastating. Techniques created to destroy Christianity became tools to impose it. Documents in Seville show detailed instructions for missionaries that explicitly cite Nordic conversion methods. They included techniques to break native spiritual resistance through systematic profanation of indigenous sacred objects and forced replacement of ancestral rituals. During the 20th century, totalitarian regimes studied and applied Viking methods on an industrial scale. Nazi documents found after World War II include translations of Icelandic sagas with specific annotations about spiritual re-education techniques. Nazi concentration camps incorporated direct elements of Viking anti-temples. Captured synagogues were converted into centers of religious humiliation using the same sacred inversion techniques that Vikings had applied to Christian churches. Jewish sacred objects were systematically perverted to break spiritual resistance before physical destruction. The Soviet Union applied similar methods against Orthodox Christianity. Viking processing rooms became the model for atheist re-education centers where Orthodox clerics were forced to publicly renounce their faith through techniques traceable to Ivar's Protocols. Today, human rights organizations have identified at least 38 contemporary situations where groups persecute religious minorities using variations of Viking techniques. From re-education camps in Asia to ethnic religious persecutions in Africa, the patterns remain consistent with methods developed 1,000 years ago. The modern psychological warfare industry uses fundamental principles of spiritual manipulation that were first systematized by Vikings. The techniques changed from inverted parchments to digital propaganda, but the psychological mechanisms of conviction breaking remain identical. The truth is that when you watch Vikings on Netflix and see noble warriors seeking adventure, you are seeing the greatest historical revision ever produced. Vikings were not romantic explorers. They were the architects of the most sophisticated religious persecution methods in human history. Every time a religious minority is re-educated, every time sacred texts are reinterpreted by hostile authorities, every time spiritual leaders are forced to denounce their own beliefs, we are seeing direct echoes of innovations developed by men like Ivar the Boneless. The Viking legacy is not the museums of Oslo or television series. It is a set of techniques for systematic destruction of religious faith that never stopped being used and refined. And if you want to understand how these millennial methods influence religious conflicts you see in the news today, leave a comment below. Because this story has developments that will change your view of practically every modern religious conflict.